June 21st, 2025, the United States bombs Iran, reportedly to back Israel's strikes. But what if I told you that this wasn't just about politics, oil, or terrorism? What if I told you it was about trauma? Not individual trauma, but national trauma. 3 countries, 3 identities shaped by betrayal, genocide, and fear. To really understand this conflict, we need to look beneath the headlines. Because this isn't just about power plays. It's about psychology. The psychological forces at play here. Collective trauma. When an entire country remembers pain as if it just happened. Sacred values. Beliefs so core to who you are. You'd rather fight than compromise. Identity fusion. When personal and national identity feel like the same thing. Anticipatory defense, striking first out of fear you won't survive waiting. Savior complex, believing it's your job to keep order even if no one asked you to. Motivated reasoning, filtering facts to fit your fear, not the other way around. Keep these in the back of your mind. Once you begin to understand how these patterns work, the headlines will start to make a lot more sense. Trauma doesn't just shape individuals. It shapes entire nations. When a country experiences existential fear, betrayal, or humiliation, that memory embeds itself in its identity. It becomes part of how the nation sees the world and how it defends itself against it. For Israel, trauma isn't ancient history. It's living memory. Born from the ashes of the Holocaust, Israel's national identity was forged in survival. 6 million Jews were murdered in Nazi-occupied Europe. The lesson burned into Jewish consciousness? You can't rely on anyone else to protect you. So in 1948, Israel was created as a homeland for Jews. But it didn't arrive into peace. It arrived into war. Every generation since has lived through violent conflict. The 1967 Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, suicide bombings, rocket attacks, and now, terrorist groups like Hamas. The result? A nation where vigilance isn't just policy, it's culture. Israelis grow up believing that survival depends on strength, that if they let their guard down, they might not exist tomorrow. Even when critics say they've gone too far, Israelis often see it as necessary, because they've learned the hard way what happens when you wait too long to act. It doesn't excuse every action, but it does explain the mindset. Humiliation, especially when inflicted by outsiders, can drive a nation's obsession with reclaiming control. Iran is not just a country. It's the remnants of Persia, one of the oldest empires in human history. For over 2,500 years, Persia ruled, traded, and influenced the world. That legacy still pulses through Iranian pride. But in 1953, the CIA and British intelligence helped overthrow Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. Why? Because he nationalized Iran's oil. That coup reinstalled the Shah, a pro-Western monarch who ruled with brutality and corruption. For many Iranians, especially religious conservatives, the West didn't just interfere. They betrayed them. That pain erupted in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Since then, Iran has positioned itself as a defiant force against Western domination, especially the United States and Israel. When Iran supports Hezbollah or pushes for nuclear power, it's often portrayed as aggression. But inside Iran, many see it as resistance, as reclaiming dignity. To them, it's not terrorism, it's autonomy. Again, this doesn't justify every choice, but it explains why Iran remains obsessed with sovereignty and suspicious of every Western move. Nations with global power often develop what psychologists call a savior complex. They see themselves as defenders of order, but may become blind to how others experience their intervention. The United States came out of World War II as a superpower, and with that came a new identity, the defender of freedom, democracy, and Western values. Israel was seen not just as an ally, but as a spiritual and strategic partner in the Middle East. Iran went from being a puppet to a problem, and then, post 9/11, part of the axis of evil. American psychology around the Middle East is a mix of guilt, fear, and idealism. Guilt for not acting sooner during the Holocaust, fear of terrorism and nuclear threats, and idealism, the belief that American values can fix broken regions. But to other nations, U.S. involvement often feels like manipulation. And that's where the disconnect begins. What one side sees as protection, the other sees as control. These aren't just nations with flags and armies. They're trauma survivors sending messages in all caps, misreading each other, and bracing for betrayal, because that's what history has taught them to expect. When religion, identity, and politics become entangled, disagreement stops feeling like debate and starts feeling like a threat to existence. In that psychological space, compromise isn't seen as peace, it's seen as betrayal. Judaism is a religion. Zionism is a political ideology. This seems simple, but most people outside the conflict never learn this distinction. Judaism is thousands of years old. It's a faith, a culture, a peoplehood. You can be Jewish by birth, by belief, or by both. Millions of Jews around the world live outside of Israel and have no political connection to the Israeli state. Zionism, by contrast, is a modern movement that began in the late 1800s. Its goal was to establish a Jewish homeland, partly in response to centuries of persecution. After the Holocaust, support for Zionism skyrocketed, and in 1948, Israel was founded. But here's the catch: not all Jews are Zionists, and not all Zionists are Jews. There are Jewish people who strongly oppose the Israeli state's actions, or even its existence, as a distortion of their spiritual tradition. And there are Christian Zionists, especially in the United States, who support Israel not for Jewish reasons, but for biblical or geopolitical ones. So when someone criticizes the Israeli government, they're not necessarily being anti-Semitic. But because identity and politics have become so fused, even fair criticism can be felt as an attack on a people. And that's what makes dialogue so fragile. Because the moment identity becomes inseparable from policy, disagreement becomes existential. Iran is officially an Islamic republic. But Islam in Iran isn't just a religion. It's part of the state's identity, law, and legitimacy. After the 1979 revolution, Iran's leaders used Shia Islam to fill the psychological void left by decades of Western domination and royal corruption. They didn't just reject the Shah, they replaced him with a spiritual leader, the Ayatollah. In Shia Islam, there's a deep tradition of martyrdom, resistance, and enduring injustice in the name of faith. The story of Imam Hussein, who died fighting a corrupt empire, is central. For many Iranians, especially those loyal to the regime, this isn't just theology. It's a roadmap for identity. Be righteous, even if you are outnumbered. That's why Iran often paints itself as the defender of the oppressed Muslims, especially Palestinians. Even when it's politically risky, it fits the psychological script. We are the faithful few, resisting the corrupt many. This merging of faith and nationalism makes Iran nearly immune to outside pressure. Because it's not just about strategy, it's about purpose. And when people believe they are fighting a sacred battle, sanctions and diplomacy often feel irrelevant. In the United States, support for Israel isn't just about democracy or security. It's also about theology. Millions of evangelical Christians believe the existence of Israel fulfills biblical prophecy. In this view, supporting Israel isn't just politically wise, it's spiritually necessary. This belief system, known as Christian Zionism, has quietly shaped U.S. foreign policy for decades. Politicians know that millions of voters see Israel not just as a country, but as a miracle. And to oppose or criticize it risks being seen as opposing God's plan. This creates a powerful psychological alignment. Israel is seen as the chosen people, America is the global protector. Iran becomes the villain. So even when geopolitics suggest nuance, domestic politics and religious psychology push for unwavering loyalty. And just like with Iran or Israel, once faith is fused with national identity, it becomes incredibly hard to separate belief from policy. Nations have collective memory just like individuals. But memory isn't objective. It's selective, emotional, and often passed down like folklore. And when a country's past trauma becomes the lens for interpreting every new event, it doesn't just remember history, it relives it. In 1953, Iran had a democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, which had been dominated by British companies. The West responded with a covert operation, Operation Ajax. The CIA and MI6 orchestrated a coup that removed Mossadegh and reinstalled the Shah, who ruled with brutality. To most Iranians, this was a national trauma. Their democracy was crushed, their independence was stolen, and their future was hijacked by foreign hands. And even though many Americans don't know this story, Iranians do. It's taught. It's remembered. It's relived every time the West talks about freedom and democracy while threatening their sovereignty. For Israel, memory begins, and never fully leaves, the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were exterminated in Europe while the world largely stood by. The lesson? No one is coming to save us. Israel's national psyche was built around two simultaneous truths. We deserve a home, and that home will never be safe unless we defend it ourselves. From the Holocaust to the 1948 war, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, and countless terrorist attacks, Israel doesn't just remember history, it watches it echo. For Americans, the defining trauma of the 21st century was 9/11. It wasn't just the deadliest terror attack on U.S. soil, it shattered the illusion of safety. The result was a psychological shift, from invincibility to vigilance, from optimism to preemptive fear. And because Iran's regime was defiant, Islamic, and hostile to Israel, it became an easy fit for America's post-9/11 fear script. Just like Israel sees Iran through the Holocaust, and Iran sees the West through the 1953 coup, the U.S. now sees the entire Middle East through the lens of 9/11. Iran believes the West always has a hidden motive. Israel believes it must hit first, or risk disappearing. The U.S. believes that if it doesn't control the chaos, it becomes the next target. And here's the trap. Each side believes it's defending itself, but the other sees that behavior as a threat. When people are denied a nation, they are denied the psychological scaffolding that gives most identities stability, borders, belonging, and the right to exist. Palestinian psychology isn't just shaped by conflict, it's shaped by absence. For generations, many Palestinians have lived in a state of permanent displacement, in refugee camps, under occupation, or in diaspora. Their identity is shaped by generational trauma and a painful reality. The world keeps debating them, but rarely listens to them. This leads to what psychologists call identity by negation. We are the people who were erased. In this framework, negotiations can feel like surrender. Protests, however disruptive, can feel like the only available voice. When your trauma isn't just historical but ongoing, compromise doesn't feel like peace. It feels like being erased again. And when the loudest voices come from those in power, the stateless often go unheard, until they make noise that cannot be ignored. When identity is threatened, the brain activates the same fear circuits as when the body is in danger. Nations, just like people, will go to extreme lengths to protect who they believe they are, even if no physical attack has occurred. Fear doesn't have to be rational to feel real. From a distance, it may seem like these three countries, Israel, Iran, and the US, are reacting to each other's strategies. But from the inside, They're responding to threats to identity. And when that identity is fused with trauma or purpose, even symbolic threats can feel like a matter of life or death. Israel has one of the most advanced militaries in the world. It has nuclear weapons, US backing, and strong regional intelligence. But it also has one of the deepest existential fears of any modern nation. Surrounded by hostile actors, condemned frequently in the international arena, and carrying the memory of genocide, Israel's psyche is shaped by anticipatory defense, the instinct to strike first, because being wrong about a threat is unthinkable. Every protest can feel like anti-Semitism. Every rocket, like the beginning of annihilation. Every criticism, like another warning ignored. Iran lives under sanctions, isolation, and suspicion. But instead of submission, its regime has adopted a defiant identity, one where power is about reclaiming dignity more than winning favor. Every demand feels like a trap, every negotiation like a trick, every concession like self-erasure. To Iran, saying no isn't just political, it's personal. When control is your trauma, sovereignty becomes sacred. The US sees itself as a global stabilizer. But psychologically, this is often rooted in what therapists call a control schema. The belief that unless you are in charge, everything falls apart. After 9/11, this belief hardened. It shaped the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the expansion of intelligence agencies, and the logic behind drone strikes and alliances. Every rogue state feels like a ticking bomb. Every regional dispute feels like a potential domino. Every withdrawal feels like an invitation for chaos. The idea of national psychology is useful, but honestly, it's incomplete. Because, no nation is truly unified. What often looks like a single voice is actually the result of competing factions, silenced dissent, and power struggles within. In Israel, there's deep tension between secular and religious Jews, left and right, Zionist and anti-Zionist. Some protest the government's policies toward Palestinians, while others demand stronger defense. In Iran, the regime rules through fear, but large swaths of the population, especially youth and women, oppose it. Protests erupt regularly. Many Iranians dream of democracy, not theocracy. In the United States, foreign policy isn't consensus, it's conflict. From neoconservatives to isolationists, anti-war progressives to military-industrial hawks, Americans disagree profoundly about the country's global role. So when we say a country believes something, we're usually referring to the beliefs of those currently in power. Nations behave like people, but they argue like families. And sometimes, what looks like aggression outward is a way to avoid collapse inward. The brain reacts more strongly to emotionally charged information than to rational analysis. In a media-saturated world, fear spreads faster than facts, and identity threats get amplified, not examined. When you scroll through your feed, watch the news, or overhear conversations about Israel, Iran, and the United States, you're rarely getting context. You're getting emotionally packaged headlines, sound bites, and viral clips designed to provoke, not inform. This isn't just a flaw in the system. It's a psychological design. Studies show that content that triggers moral outrage is more likely to be shared, commented on, and remembered. So social media platforms, driven by engagement algorithms, prioritize conflict. And when people are confused about an issue, they don't usually seek out balanced education. They look for identity-confirming content, the stuff that tells them their side is right, and the other side is dangerous. Psychologists call this cognitive simplification. When a topic becomes too complex or emotionally overwhelming, the brain reduces it to binaries: good versus evil, oppressed versus oppressor, us versus them. So instead of understanding the history of Zionism, or the difference between Iran's people and its regime, or why the United States supports Israel in some contexts and not others, we get Israel is genocidal, Iran is pure evil. The United States is either saving the world or destroying it. And when that's all you see, Your psychology responds with one of two things: defensiveness or aggression. Let's say a false story goes viral. Maybe it shows a bombing out of context, or quotes a leader inaccurately, or shares a manipulated photo. Even after it's disproven, the emotional reaction remains. Why? Because misinformation doesn't just change what people know, it changes what they feel they must protect. This creates what psychologists call motivated reasoning. You don't ask, "Is this true?" You ask, "Does this fit how I already see the world?" In conflicts where every side feels historically betrayed, misinformation acts like gasoline on an open fire. Each country has its own internal media ecosystem, shaped by its cultural psychology. Iranian state media portrays Israel and the United States as imperial aggressors. Israeli media often emphasizes existential threats and justifies military response. American media spotlights U.S. heroism, or polarizes into pro-Israel versus pro-Palestinian. The result? A global conversation where no one is seeing the same story, but everyone believes they have the truth. Governments know this. Leaders know this. Propagandists especially know this. They don't need to change what you think. They just need to trigger what you feel: fear, anger, loyalty, disgust, and let your psychology do the rest. Because once the conversation is emotionally hijacked, people stop asking, "What's actually happening?" and start declaring, "Whose side are you on?" You don't have to pick a side to understand a conflict. In fact, the most powerful position you can take is to understand how sides are formed and why we cling to them so tightly. Let's be clear. You can understand why Israel fears annihilation without agreeing with its military decisions. You can understand Iran's desire for sovereignty without supporting its regime. You can understand America's need for global control without endorsing every war or sanction. Understanding isn't the same as endorsement. It's the opposite of ignorance. It's a form of psychological resilience, the ability to witness complexity without collapsing into tribal thinking. When a child is abandoned, they grow up with attachment wounds. When someone is betrayed, they develop trust issues. When someone is abused, they may learn to hit before they get hit. Nations aren't that different. Israel was nearly wiped out. Now it fears disappearing again. Iran was used and overthrown. Now it resists with fury. The United States was blindsided. Now it controls to avoid chaos. These aren't just political decisions. They're psychological defenses, built from real wounds. And when you start to see nations as trauma survivors, you stop asking, "Why are they like this?" and start asking, "What happened to them?" Maybe you're not a policymaker. Maybe you're not from any of these countries. So why should this matter to you? Because if you want to live in a world with less fear, less war, and less misinformation, you have to become the kind of person who sees clearly. When everyone else is choosing sides, you choose insight. When outrage is trending, you ask better questions. When history repeats, you recognize the pattern and step outside of it. That doesn't make you passive. It makes you powerful. There's a big difference between being numb and being wise, between checking out and zooming out. You're not weak for refusing to jump into every internet argument. You're not heartless for seeing the pain on all sides. And you're not naive for hoping that psychology, real, human, vulnerable psychology, might be the key to breaking the cycle. Because it might be. So when the United States drops bombs on Iran to support Israel, it's not just about territory, not just about terror. It's about three nations trying not to bleed from old wounds by creating new ones. This video isn't about who's right. It's about why this conflict feels so impossible to resolve. Not because people are evil, but because people are scared. Because trauma talks louder than reason. Because when identity becomes sacred, every disagreement becomes a war. But now, you don't have to be confused. You don't have to pick a side. You just have to keep asking the harder, wiser question. What's driving this behavior?